Today's episode is brought to you by Modern Grower. Modern Grower is your source for time and labor-saving farm tools, such as the Paper Pot Transplanter, Quick Click Seeder, and the Jang Direct Seeder. Turn laborsome tasks into free time with tools by Modern Grower. You did a lot of work around dung beetles. For people who aren't familiar, can you give us a basic 101 overview of their role in this specific grazing ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So most people's perception of dung beetle, it's very abstract. It's the very fun National Geographic, an elephant lays a dung patch and you've got those beetles that you see on the National Geographic channel that mold into a ball and you see them roll away. And that is incredibly cool. In South Dakota and a lot of the Midwest, there's a really diverse community of dung beetles, but most of them aren't those rollers. A lot of them aren't quite as visible. So anytime a dung patch gets leaved, these dung beetles and insects, they have antennae that are incredibly sensitive. And so to us, what smells repulsive and a lot like something we want to stay away from, that is something that they are honed in on. And from a couple minutes after that fresh pat hits the ground, you can see them zooming in and taking advantage of this real ephemeral resource. Dung beetles, so this is where you might not want to be eating at any portion, but when it's wet and fresh, the pat, that's when it's most attractive to the beetles. And so they're coming in, the adults are eating it, but what's more importantly is, for the dung beetle's perspective, is they're some of the best parents of the insect world. So those balls that you see them on TV oftentimes rolling, that they're moving it away and they'll lay an egg in that dung ball. And that's where a larva, a young beetle, will have inside that dung ball, be both living inside and have a meal in the form of that dung ball. And then they'll live inside it, eat until they can grow up to an adult beetle, and they'll emerge from it. In South Dakota, a lot of those dung beetles are actually laying their eggs out of that dung pat or directly under it in that area right where the dung pat meets the soil surface. Some also called tunnelers, will dig a tunnel either right next to or directly underneath that dung pat and then pull bits of that dung and make little chambers for their larvae to develop on. And why that's so important is, if you didn't have these dung beetles out there, those dung pats would just sit on the soil surface and sit, and some amount of them that moisture would evaporate, but there's that crispy layer of the plant material that, if it isn't broken down, can sit there, and that can result in pasture fouling. It's hard for that new growth to come up through that dung pat, and your pasture just won't be as productive in the following years. And you can get to this nightmare scenario where if nothing's breaking up that dung pad, it can build up and lead to a point where that pasture is unusable. And when you've got a pasture or a landscape that has a lot of these dung beetles breaking apart the patch and shredding it up, it allows for new grass to come through and make in successive years that new growth accessible to cattle. On top of that, in the cattle's dung is a lot of nasty parasites. So the worms and those nasty things that we think of, that if that pat stays there, it becomes a place where the eggs that pass through the cattle can develop and move out of that pat, go into the new grass and be eaten up by cattle. And that's how these problems inside the cattle build up. But if the dung beetles are breaking apart that dung pat and burying it and moving it around, that has been found to dramatically reduce the amount of parasites that are able to exist within that system. And so that's one other, you don't think of it as a service that these dung beetles are providing, but they're their own veterinary service. By them, they themselves are controlling or reducing the amount of potentially harmful pathogens and parasites that are living within that pasture.
In pasture systems today, how is the dung beetle population? Optimum, low, high? Where are we at?
Yeah, so that was one thing in my work in South Dakota we were trying to get at, because even though they're providing this really essential service, you're limited on the knowledge base that's out there. So we wanted to look at how in today's pasture system, how the management of the cattle is having a cascading effect towards the management of, or the effect that it has on these dung beetles that inadvertently these ranches are managing. And we found some systems that were incredible. You'd have, just when you take a sample of that dung pad, and what that amounted to for us was taking a cup cutter. So it's what you use to dig a golf hole on a golf course. It's that implement co-opted into, instead of a hole on a putting green, you stick it on top of a dung pat. And so you would have this cylinder of soil and dung, and we would go back to the lab and look at how many dung beetles would be in that, if you can imagine the size of a golf hole.
So
You'd have
that's like
dozens.
4 inches across. How many would you have in there?
Yeah, within that amount of dung, dozens of adult beetles across up to 10 different species that we were finding living in there. And that's a really robust community. And what we found is the systems that had that kind of dung beetle community, those are growers who, as part of a very deliberate decision, they are rotating their cattle very frequently. So if you can imagine one giant fenced area where in the spring you put the cattle out, they have free range to move that large area all summer long, and then you bring them at the end of the year, compared to what I'm talking about, this really high intensity grazing where they put a lot of cattle in a relatively small area with enough forage and fresh grass to eat, and they hit it really hard, and then they open up maybe after a day or two a gate, and then the cattle move to right next to it another small patch of the paddock or the small pad of the pasture, and the cattle hit that really hard. And then this is replicating how these large ruminants or hoofed mammals would be moving in these plains historically. Before cattle were doing it, it was large deer and bison. Those are what we think of, these large hoofed mammals that used to go there. And so they would hit small patches very hard. They would, with their hooves, trample it with their dung that they leave behind, and then they would move on. And so after that pasture's been grazed, it has a really long rest period. So it might not be grazed again till that time next year or even longer. And by having that really intensive rotation, the growers found that they were also able to reduce, or in some cases remove, the veterinary products. So they weren't giving the cattle the parasiticides, the things like the products that are actually administered, whether it be ingested by the cows or poured on. But a lot of those chemicals, they're systemic, so they can move through the tissue of the animal. But a large percentage of those products, whatever you apply, ends up in the dung pat. And so these dung pats, if these veterinary products are applied, have a lot of insecticides or parasiticides that can be really harmful to these dung beetle and other insect populations. So in a system where the grower is rotating really frequently, reducing those add-ons or pour-ons or veterinary products, would you believe it, they had these really incredible diverse dung beetle populations. And then you could get to the opposite end of the spectrum where, yeah, you'd still see some dung beetles, but you wouldn't see near as many. It would be maybe a couple miles down the road where we were sampling these farms. So it's relatively the same kind of climate, and outside of how the grower is managing these pastures, these dung beetles are living in the same sort of environment, but it would be only a fraction of what we would see. And we followed up with an experiment where in one of those really nice pastures, we would make our own sentinel dung pats, where we collected fresh cattle dung, put it in, we weighed it, so we knew relatively this how a standardized weight of those pats. We would put them out in the field. Half of them we would leave open free to dung beetles or whatever would want to colonize it. And then half of them we covered it up with a mesh screen. So the things that were living in the soil could still access it. Earthworms could still get in there, or those microinvertebrates, but dung beetles really couldn't get into it. And we found that those dung pats that were able to be colonized by dung beetles broke down so much faster than those ones. As you can imagine, these dung beetles are really large. They're able to get compared to almost any other insect that you would find in these dung pats, and doing a really good job of assisting in the breakdown. So it's really dependent on management. If the grower is conscious and trying to replicate these natural systems and do a good job of the cattle frequently, we found that the dung beetles really were able to take advantage of that and succeed as well.
Hey there! Tired of spending forever seeding nursery trays by hand? Meet the Quick Click Drop Seeder. It makes seeding trays super fast. Just a click and you're done. You can seed multiple trays in no time, making your nursery work way easier. Plus, it works with paper pot trays, microgreens, and any other tray that you have. Say goodbye to tedious seeding and hello to more time on the farm. Join hundreds of other farmers and try the Quick Click Seeder today. Available at shop.moderngrower.co or using the link below.